Before we start, I was reading something in Samuel, and I think it's so apropos for today. So let me just read it. It's 1 Samuel 2, 7 through 8. It says, Adonai makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and also lifts up. He raises the helpless from the dust. He lifts the needy from the dunghill to make them sit with nobles, granting them a seat of honor.
Amen.
I think this is a great reading for Purim. Purim, often pronounced Purim in the West, it basically talks about the festival of lots. And it doesn't have a very good connotation because those lots determined the day that evil was supposed to annihilate all the Jewish people in one day. So it's the Feast of Lots that we are looking at today, the Festival of Lots, and it's called Purim. One lot is a pur, and multiple lots are Purim. So we're going to look at Purim then, and I'm going to turn this on here. All right, so the eternal principle concerning the Jewish people begins with, and I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee. And in thee all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Of course, the greatest blessing is that from those Jewish families came the Messiah. And through him all nations of the earth would be blessed, all the peoples of the earth would be blessed. We find that in Genesis 12:3, right at the very beginning. So here in this picture here, I'm an artist, so I love lots of pictures. I always learn greatly through pictures. And here we see our heroine of the story. On the left, we see Esther. Esther was really named Hadassah. Hadassah means myrtle, but she had to hide her Jewishness, and so she became known as Esther, which was like a Babylonian name. And so Purim is a lot about being hidden, not seeing things that are really there. And that becomes a central theme of Purim. And here we see the evil Haman over here. And Haman is in a chair because he is now found out. The king is wise to him now because Esther has exposed his evil plot to annihilate all of the Jews. And his evil intentions. The king is now aware of that, and now he is condemned. He's one that began to accuse, and now he's been accused. And then in the background, we see the king, King Ahasuerus, and he's also known as King. He has a couple different names, so we'll go through those a little bit. So anyway, this painting is pretty incredible when you look at what's actually happening here. Lesser Jewish Festival held in the spring on the 14th or the 15th day of Adar, which is the 12th month of the Jewish calendar. It commemorates the defeat of Haman's plot to massacre the Jews as recorded in the book of Esther. Esther is a small book. It only has like 10 chapters to it, and it's 2 books behind the Psalms. So the Psalms are always the easiest go-to to find the Bible, just halfway through. So if you go to the halfway point, then you just turn a little bit to the left, you're going to get there if you pass over the book of Job. So it's celebrated on the 14th and 15th because the day that the lot was drawn to annihilate all the Jewish people, that was on the 13th. And so that was the day that they rested after that battle then, that they were victorious and that God gave them the victory. So the big book of Esther is the only biblical book that does not include God's name. And it's been speculated why that is. And the thought is that God is always so present that it's not even necessary to mention that he's there because he's doing all these things supernaturally on our behalf. And all these things that happened couldn't have happened without his divine intervention. And so we don't see actually God's name mentioned. And the reason I use hyphenate, some people ask me, why do I use hyphenate God's name? Because in the book of Deuteronomy, when the Jewish people were told to wipe out an enemy of God, that they were to destroy everything. And so they felt that if they were ever attacked and anybody else was going to destroy everything, they would never want the name of God to be destroyed, so they wouldn't actually write it. They just kind of imply it. And even speaking today, Jews will say, they'll use the name Hashem, which is the name, blessed be the name, because it's such a holy thing that they guard and wants to be kept safe always. So when we talk about the book of Esther, we're actually talking about a Megillah. There are 6 Megillahs, and a Megillah is a scroll, basically. We use the term book loosely, but this is a Megillah. This is actually the Megillah of Ruth. It's not of Esther, but there are 6 different Megillahs, and so that's one of them. And these are always read, at the holidays. So during the holiday of Purim, you'd have those 10 chapters of Esther read. Okay, some of the main characters here, if we look at the left, we see Mordecai. Mordecai was the first cousin of Esther, or Hadassah, and Esther's parents both passed away, so he raised her as his own daughter. And he was a great confidant and a vizier to the king. And so he was very valuable to the king, and he always encouraged Esther to keep her identity hidden for her own safety. Because if we look back in time, the whole reason that they are in this Persian story is because they were taken out of Jerusalem when the first temple was destroyed during the Babylonian captivity, and so that's why they were there to begin with. And then when the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, then they were in control then. And then later we know that the Persians were conquered by the Greeks, and then later the Greeks were conquered by the Romans, and so on and so forth. So a lot of history there, but that's why they're there to begin with. So there are people that were there because of captivity. And then in the middle there we see the evil Haman. Haman was known as Haman the Agagite because he was a descendant of King Agag. Agag was, if we remember the story of King Saul, that actually Esther was in his royal family lineage because of the name Kish that follows that. But that's a whole other story. But Haman was the Agagite because he was from the line of King Agag. And they were of the line of the Amalekites going back to the lineage of Esau, way back in the Bible, where we see Amalek. And so from them came the Amalekites that the Agagites were part of. And they were the chief enemies of Israel that wanted Israel always wiped out. Today, just I'm sure out of coincidence, these are the descendants of the Iranians today. Think about that. Pause, Selah. All right, and then we have Ahasuerus, who was the king of Persia, and this takes place in his 3rd year of his kingship. And he is married to Vashti, who's on the right there. Vashti was the queen. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he was celebrating for 180 days the wealth of his empire and how successful they were, living lavishly. 180 days. Now, I mean, I was on a cruise ship once, and it was a week, and that was about all I could have. But I'm thinking 180 days of just celebrating and partying. How tired you must have been. But I mean, it must have been working out for them. And then after that 180 days, he had to have a 7-day feast day then for the general population too. He didn't want to cut them out. So went first for the nobles and all the people that were higher ups in his kingdom, and then for the local people. And while he was having this 7-day festival, on the 7th day, he was pretty well looped. and he wanted to show off his beautiful wife Vashti. She was known for her beauty, but she was having a party of her own with the women, and when he sent over his eunuchs to go fetch Vashti, she didn't want to come over. She said, "No, I'm not doing that." Well, you don't say that to the king. And so the king's people that surrounded him, all his counselors said, "She's just basically disrespected you. And we can never have that, because if she can get away with it to the king, then what will that do for all the women in the kingdom? They won't respect their own husbands. We can't have this." So then as he's kind of, listening to all these things, trying to figure things out, the next day he decides that Vashti needs to be removed from her office. Most likely she was killed, most likely. Some people say she was just exiled, but most stories say that she was killed. So anyway, she had to be replaced. And so they had a contest where they had the beautiful women from 127 different provinces, all the way from the top of Egypt to India. There were 127 provinces that were part of the Persian Empire. And so these people were taken by force. So if you were one of the lucky, beautiful people in the world, and you got taken, and then they had a big preparation time for those people that made the cut, you might say, and it was like 6 months of just being bathed in perfumed water and myrrh, and then you had another 6 months of having cosmetic treatments and dealing with other beauty things. And then you were ready to be selected again. Okay, so if you made the cut here, then then you would wait to see if the king would call you back. And so after your first night with the king, then they would wait. And if you were lucky enough to be called back, then it was like your second interview, you might say. And so the long and the short of it is that Esther won that contest, and then she replaced Vashti. She became the queen of Persia then. And so she is the queen to Ahasuerus, who was also known as Xerxes, and he was also known as Artaxerxes, depending which version you're reading. And one of the most famous quotes from Purim will be, "If you will remain silent at this time, relief and salvation will come to the Jews from another source." And this is told to her by Mordecai when she finds out that Haman has decided to kill all the Jews. Now, why was Haman so hateful of the Jewish people? Because they wouldn't bow to him. Jews don't bow to anybody but God. And so when they wouldn't bow to him, that was such an insult. And it's like, who are you not to bow to me? I'm really somebody. You're nobody. And so they plotted to kill all the Jews then because of that. And he went to the king, and he said, we have a people amongst us that are not really a part of us. They don't really have our customs, or do they want to have our customs? They won't bow to us. They won't bow to you. They won't bow to me. We need to wipe them out across the whole empire here. And so he convinces the king that this would be a good idea. And the king takes his signet ring and he stamps it. And once it becomes a law, it can't be revoked. So it's a done deal. Then the lots are thrown, they're cast, and they decide that the day that this is going to happen is the 13th of Adar, the 12th month of the Jewish calendar. And you and the house of your father will be lost, and who knows if it's not for just such a time as this that you reach this royal position. So again, we see the hand of God, although it's not spelled out distinctly. We see the hand of God, that we know that there has to be divine intervention here. That God has selected this person named Esther now, the old former Hadassah, and she's going to end up saving her people. But if she decides not to, God will choose somebody else. It will be accomplished. because Messiah will be born through the Jewish line. And fear not them which kill the body, but are able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. So this is talking about the fear factor that Esther must have been feeling, because she would have to approach the king, and nobody approaches the king, not even the queen, without invitation. And so Mordecai is saying, you need to talk to the king. You need to intervene for your people. She's saying, but I can't. I'm afraid I can't. I'll be killed if I just go before him without invitation. And so she prays and fasts for 3 days, and then she opens the door to his courtroom, his big hall, and everybody's aghast. It's like the queen is now before you without invitation. So if he didn't extend his golden scepter to her, she would have perished. She would have been just like Vashti, gone. And he sees that she has great need, and his love for her becomes active, and he extends his golden scepter to Esther. Then Esther bade them to return Mordecai this answer: go gather all the Jews that are present in Shushan, which was the capital city of the Persian Empire, and fast ye for me, and neither eat or drink for 3 days or nights. So the official edict of fasting first. And we know that when we're in a very heavy situation, that fasting is something that God wants us to do. It's not something that is an unusual thing. That's kind of expected of us, that we would fast on anything that's very, very important to us. Now, before this, there was a story too when Mordecai would always go to the king's gate, and he would wait to talk to Esther. And one time when he was at the gate, he overheard 2 of the officials for King Ahasuerus, and they wanted to plot to kill him. And so he tells Esther about this, and he says, warn the king that this is going to happen. And so he does, and they do an expose on these 2 gentlemen, and they're found out that they wanted to have this plot to kill the king. And so they are put up on a pole, they're impaled, and it's written in the official annals that Mordecai, the Jew, was responsible for preventing this terrible thing from happening to the king. So he knows about it, and it's written in the annals, and it's put up on a shelf somewhere, kind of forgotten. It's like, that's really great, buddy. You just put it up on the shelf and kind of forgotten about it. So this is going to come to importance in a little bit here. I also and my maidens will feast likewise, and so I will go unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. I mean, she knew the gravity of the situation of approaching the king, uninvited. Hard for us to think in our own very boisterous culture where we just do what we feel needs to be done and take it or leave it. It wasn't the case in those days. So here we see that golden scepter that the king extends to Esther, allowing her to talk. And here we see her pleading before the king. And the king says, what is it that you want? And she's all, a wreck probably. She's trembling and just really anxious. And she says, I want you and Haman to come for a party I want to have tomorrow. It's like, okay. I mean, if you think about the situation, he's expecting something really big, but he wants to come to a little party you're throwing, and you want Haman and I to be there. It's like, okay. I mean, he must have been really thrown aback by that. And so the next day, then, they do have this party, and at the party he says, but what is it that you really want? What did you really want? Because she tells him that she's going to reveal what she really wanted at that party. But she doesn't do it because the timing isn't right. Timing is everything. There is a moedim, an appointed time in God's way of thinking, and you can't supersede that. It has to be according to his time schedule. And so the timing wasn't right. And so Haman, now at this point, he was made to be the prime minister now under King Ahasuerus, also known as King Ashverosh, also known as Artaxerxes and Xerxes. A lot of these people with multiple names, depending on the version here. And so Haman is like really full of himself. He's thinking that, he's the cat's meow, the empire's his basically to do with what he will. And the king says to, what do you want? What do you really want here? And she says, I want you guys to come back tomorrow for another party, and I'm going to tell you then. I mean, that's pretty gutsy, I think. When you're playing with the king's time here, I mean, you must be thinking, wow, I'm really being jerked around a little bit here, but he agrees to it. And that night, he is laying in bed, and he doesn't have any peace. He keeps rolling around in bed, and he's just bothered. He's anxious. And in his anxiety, he goes to read some of the annals that he's got stored on his shelf. He pulls out the annal that tells the episode of Mordecai, the Jew, actually saving the life of the king. And so at this party, he says to Haman, he says, what would you do, for somebody that did a great deed? How can we honor them for the king, that did a great, great thing for the king? And Haman's thinking, because he's so full of himself, he's thinking, oh, he's talking about me. He says, well, he should definitely be clothed in the king's robes, something that you worn, and he should be on one of your stallions, riding through town. He should be escorted through town so everybody can honor him. And he's thinking about all these great things because he's thinking of what he wants to have done for himself. And then the king says, all right then, we're going to do this for Mordecai the Jew. It's like, what? What? So Haman has to take Mordecai, through the streets as he's being honored. I mean, and some writings say that he held his head down here with a hood over it because he was so ashamed, to be seen escorting this Mordecai the Jew through the streets, somebody that he wants to have annihilated. And so at the party then, the king says to Esther, he says, what is it that you want? And Esther then says, I plead for my life and the life of my people. Who are your people? The Jews. The Jews that Haman has convinced you to sign an edict to wipe out. And then he sees Haman for what he really is, the evil that he really is. And at that point then, the tables turn. And in his anger, he leaves the room. He's just seething. And as he leaves the room, Haman goes to Esther, and he falls at her feet and actually falls into her. And so when the king comes back, he sees Haman practically in her lap. And now he thinks he's not only trying to wipe out people that saved his life, but also that he's now making advances towards his wife. So it's like things are really bad for Haman. And so Haman, whose wife was kind of in cahoots with him, she advised him to actually make a big gallows in their front yard, so everybody can see when Mordecai is going to be hung, or actually impaled. I think hung and then impaled. And so it was 50 feet high, and so the king says, okay, Haman, you're going to be the one that's going to be hung and impaled on this contraption that you created for Mordecai. And so he's killed on it. And then the 10 sons are also executed on the gallows. If it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan, the capital to do tomorrow, also according to this day, this decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. Now, you might think that this is just what I just said, but no, this is after the fact that they were already hung. In the Jewish text, it is written as a list, and there's a double list. And it doesn't make any sense to just the average reader, because you think, well, why are they saying that? Because how can you hang somebody who's already hanged? Because it's futuristic. It's prophetic for what will happen in the future. And then how it's written is very, very interesting, because there are 3 words that have a smaller letter that corresponds to a number. In Hebrew, every letter has a geometrical value or a number associated with it. And the numbers will be 707. Okay? Now there's a capital letter associated with one of the other words of one of the sons' names. And it's different than all the other letters. And it relates to what millennial period. And the year was 5707. Which equates to 1946. And I think this is one of the stories that it just makes goosebumps go down your back, thinking that this story of Purim is realized in the year 1946 again, as 10 people at the Nuremberg trials are up for war crimes during World War II. And we have Julius Streicher of Der Stürmer, the Stormer magazine, very anxious to get rid of the Jewish people. They were very knowledgeable of Purim. In fact, Adolf Hitler even forbade Purim to be celebrated because he knew that this could happen again. And then 2 other times he made edicts forbidding anything associated with Purim even to take place. So it was very real to them. They understood it. And kind of a takeaway too is even the devil knows what the Bible says. And he's very privy to that. It doesn't come as a surprise to him. He's not creative. He doesn't create anything, but he knows what is going to happen, and he will try to dupe people into not knowing that. And so here we see in the year 5707, we see that these people are on trial at Nuremberg. We see Hermann Goering in the top left corner. He's in a prison, and he's going to be taken for trial. But there was a Nazi sympathizer, a guard that slipped him some cyanide, and so he died before he could be tried. And then the other 10 went up there to be tried. And when Julius Streicher gets up there, one of the last things that he yells out is Purim Fest 1946. Because he understood that this prophecy has now been fulfilled. And actually in Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler's work, he talks about Purim also in there, that should the Jews have a victory, that they will uproot all of Europe. And so he takes what was meant for good and turns it for evil. Kind of like we see some leaders today saying that, good countries are actually evil and they're the bandits and they're the rebels and they need to be wiped out, while they're actually the ones themselves. So, very interesting fact, Purim Fest 1946. Getting back to Esther, therefore the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of great gladness and fasting and feasting, and a good day, and of sending portions to one another. So it's a kind of time of giving gifts because it's a celebration too. It's a day of a lot of drinking of alcohol because of their jubilation. And it's just a massive celebration day for the Jewish people. So because something was already written and it couldn't be taken back, it couldn't be reverted, he can't say, well, I've had this edict put in 127 provinces that on this day we're going to wipe out the Jews, and now I can't send another edict saying that now don't do it. So he does create another edict that the Jews can arm themselves and they can be ready for battle. And they had victory then in these 127 provinces, where many of the governors of those provinces actually helped the Jewish people. And there were a lot of fatalities. There were like 75,000 fatalities, 500 in the city of Shushan alone. So a lot of fatalities did happen, but the Jewish people were victorious. The Messiah was born of the Jewish line, as was prophesied. That's why we're here today. So this little 10 chapters tucked away in the Bible is very, very pivotal. And this is why we celebrate Purim, because of that fact. There is a word called Nachafu, and it means basically turned upside down or turned on its head. And that is a term that is written in the Jewish text in the book of Esther, or the Megillah of Esther. And these are some things that were turned upside down their head. So we have an exiled Jewish orphan that becomes the queen of an empire. We have the unbendingly righteous Mordecai, who is raised up from death, rode to high esteem, second only to the king himself. Because when Haman was killed, the king gave his estate to his queen. And then the queen shared it with Mordecai, who remained his vizier. And then also, this is an interesting fact too. You know, when the second temple was rebuilt, it was rebuilt because of the permission of another king. And that king's name was Cyrus, who was also known as Darius, or a lot of people say Darius. And who was that? That was Queen Esther's son, with King Ahasuerus. And so a double blessing came from that. And so the temple then was rebuilt under Cyrus or Darius, their son. And yes, it is spring coming. And yes. And I know that, it says in the Psalms that, we'll know the end from the beginning. I think that's what I just kind of did. That must have been prophecy too. As I went right back to my very first slide here. Here we are. Thank you for rescuing me there, Maggie. So the evil Haman is hung on his own gallows that were prepared for Mordecai. The evil Haman is hung on his, and the Jewish people go from being almost exterminated to having great victory and joy. So, one of the things that we do to celebrate, and I think I may have a couple slides here of that too. A lot of times they'll have a Purim festival, and people will take on a costume of the characters in the Purim story and act it out. It's a way of remembering your roots, remembering where you came from. Today it's gotten pretty wild in Israel, where people are really, it's almost like a Halloween, where people are just kind of going crazy. They've kind of gotten away from a lot of the original intentions there, unfortunately, but this is what you'll see in a lot of temples today. You'll see that reenactment. There are cookies that are at the bottom there, and Brad, would you do me a favor? Brad and Ray, would you take like a side here and pass out a cookie to everybody? Just a little bit of a lanyard here, a freebie, because it's a celebration. You're supposed to give away something on Purim. You're supposed to have gifts. So this will be my gift to you. These are called hamantashen, and hamantashen literally mean Haman's hats. They're always three-pointed, and they're filled in with poppy seed or fruit fillings. And I didn't slave over these, but I did get the last two available at BJ's. So enjoy them. These are hamantashen. We talked about drinking to celebrate. We talked about the Purim baskets that you would give to friends, and a lot of times to the poor, you buy a Purim basket so everybody can celebrate. And it's just a time of great festivity. and of course, spring. It has nothing to do with the talk, but it's still spring. Okay. So, yeah, Purim is a great holiday, and it's so meaningful today, too. I mean, you know, a couple years ago, my wife and I went to Colorado to visit my son, and he lives in the town of Aurora. Aurora was that town that was infamous for the guy dressing like the Joker from Batman with the blazing red hair. He went to a movie theater and shot people up there. You probably remember that from the news. That's where my son lives. And also, in this town of Aurora, they have a memorial to Babin Yar, which is right by Kiev, or Kiev as we would say. And it was a memorial to 35,000 Jews that were killed when the Nazis came into Kiev. They had them all come down and bring all their belongings and put them in a neat pile there, depending if you were a woman or man or a child. And then after they did that, because they were told they were going to be transported somewhere else, well, then they were told to strip down and then march to the ridge, which is a big ravine, and that's where they'd be shot and the back of their head and fall into the ravine then. And so 35,000 people perished, and they had a memorial there dedicated to the victims of Babin Yar. Now, the Ukrainians set up a huge memorial to the Holocaust at Babin Yar. And just recently in the news, you know, the Russians came in, fired a missile into it, totally decimated the whole memorial. It was kind of like being murdered twice. And the people that were even looking at the memorial, they were wiped out as well. Just disregard for human life. We see modern day Hamans like Pastor Grell was talking about. Actually, you know, Purim is interesting also because it also marks the time of Stalin of Russia, when Stalin was trying to eliminate the Jews. And it was on Purim that he died. You know, due to much prayer, you know, on behalf of the Jewish people, pleading for help from God. And also during the during the Mideast conflict with Iraq, when Saddam Hussein was firing all kinds of missiles at Israel, and they were under constant attack from him, that's when the Americans intervened at Purim and it was stopped. So, you know, these holidays are not just days on a calendar year. These are very viable things. These are things that are eternal, and these are things that we need to pay attention to, that they don't repeat, okay? And just as by one man, you know, all this sin and destruction can come in, bring thousands of people to their knees, destroy lives forever, so is it by one man, with the help of God, that things can be turned around, like with Esther. So, I want to leave you with that thought, and so I say, Happy Purim. Oh, the blessings. You want to close with the blessings? I always forget something.
Why don't we stand as we close?